Recording in progress.
Testing. Testing. We're good. All right, welcome to both the folks in the audience who came and joined us on a Friday night, and those who joined us online. I'd like to welcome you to the University of Minnesota campus, whether it's in person or virtually. My name is Dr. David Kram-Hillock. I'm the Director of Forensics here at the University of Minnesota, and we're very happy to welcome the debaters from the University of Iowa here with us. Public debate is an important part of both the Iowa and Minnesota debate program's mission, where we try to elevate public discussion about important issues, including tonight's topic, dealing with whether or not the adoption of a carbon tax would be the best solution to dealing with greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. This is actually a longstanding tradition between the University of Minnesota and the University of Iowa. I recently learned that the first debate, public debate at least, between the universities was in 1893. And the topic was whether or not the U.S. federal government should assume control of and own the U.S. telegraph system, which was probably a very important issue of the day, but is not something that those of us in the audience might be familiar with. Joining us tonight from the University of Minnesota, we have Casey Wells and Timur Ustinov. They'll be introducing themselves before their speeches. And from the University of Iowa, we have Spencer Anderson McElligott and Miley Huffman. As I noted at the top, the topic tonight is going to be whether or not the United States government should adopt a carbon tax. And when discussing that, the debaters are going to, each side is going to offer two constructives of sentiments in length. That'll be followed by a 3-minute cross-examination speech. And then there will be 5 minutes at the end of the debate for each side to offer a summation of their arguments. At the end of the debate, we'll have a brief period where the audience, whether it's online or in person, can ask the debaters questions. And we'll also have an opportunity for folks to vote on who they think won the debate. So first, I'd like to welcome up the first speaker from the affirmative, Timur Ustinov.
Right. I'll just give a quick thank you to the University of Minnesota Communications Department, Tyler Snelling, Iowa's Forensics Director, and DCH, our Forensics Director, for their facilitation of this event. We would also like to extend gratitude to Spencer and Miley from Iowa as our esteemed opponents in this debate. And finally, our audience, for there can be no public debate without the public. We hope for you all to learn more about this activity that we all love so much, and maybe even a thing or two about carbon taxes. All right. We affirm that the United States federal government should implement a carbon tax. The first is solvency. A carbon tax is the best tool to both signal global action on climate change and curb domestic emissions by increasing production efficiency, utilizing an internationally extended carbon tax for global goods levied on foreign producers and increasing new tech dispersion. Greg Bertelsen and Katarina Roerke write in 2021 for the Climate Leadership Council that the US must reassert its role as a climate leader to support rapid econ-wide decarbonization, which is essential for jumpstarting international cooperation. Cut reductions further and faster, introduce global incentives for others to rapidly reduce their emissions. A carbon price would cut domestic emissions in half by 2035, and a border carbon adjustment would extend the reach of a domestic climate policy beyond American shores. We can leverage the power of the US economy to compel reductions abroad. A large drop in emissions early has an outsized benefit. The US has an opportunity to deliver a comprehensive policy that will underpin new US commitment, ratchet up global efforts, and extend an international reach. The plan is vital to a global climate solution. A carbon tax unlocks economies of scale and flips incentives from fossil fuel development to innovation to green technology, which is necessary to solve the climate crisis. David Bailey writes in 2023 for the Climate Leadership Council that we need more rapid innovation and deployment of technology. Only an economy-wide carbon price offers this flexibility, predictability, and potential. We create incentives, reward all solutions. Price creates a pull to bring technology into the marketplace. Price would establish concrete and predictable benefits for companies' research and investment. A carbon price can unlock $1.4 trillion in capital deployment directed at meaningful innovations. Global progress requires United States innovation leadership. By leveraging US capacity through innovation, they can attain economies of a scale to reduce costs and provide tech affordably to overseas markets. Pace and range of innovation by existing policy is insufficient. US innovated decarbonization will be market viable in developing markets that represent 2/3 of emissions. Second is the first harm of climate change. Our window for action is closing rapidly. Tipping points will lock in irreversible climate change by 2030. Only a carbon tax creates global action incentives in the time required by the warming-based existential crisis. Brad Plummer writes in 2023 for the New York Times that the Earth is likely to cross a threshold for warming within the next decade. Global average temps estimated to rise 1.5 degrees around 2030 means a one chance to shift course. Delays of even a few years guarantee perilous future. Every action of additional warming increases dangers. Hazards increase as countries face heat waves, flooding, and crop failures. Diseases will spread. Without an urgently implemented economy-wide carbon tax, climate change will cause unprecedented health impacts and eventually lead to the end of life as we know it. Catriona Wiley writes in 2023 for the Australian Journal of General Practice that the WHO acknowledges climate change as the single biggest health problem facing humanity. Cry for urgent action to protect civilization. Droughts, heat waves, fires and floods, extreme weather, food and water insecurity, displacement, diseases. We have an ethical responsibility to act. We fail if we do not address the existential threat of the climate crisis. Third is the second harm, grid collapse. As electricity demand grows, the grid is experiencing more and more strain, leading to grid blackouts across the nation. Grace Wickerson et al. Writes in April of this year for FAST. Grids are facing unprecedented strain due to record high temperatures, increase in electricity consumption, 300 million people face outages, profound for vulnerable populations, significantly increases health risks. Power outages surged by 150%. 22 extreme weather events cost the United States $95 billion. Failure to improve grid resiliency and electricity supply-demand mismatches will lead to devastating national power outages and creates risk of intermittency. Chuck Brooks writes in 2023 for Forbes. Existential threat to the grid comes from acts of nature that have devastating impacts. Damage could cost $2 trillion with recovery time of 4 to 10 years. We have 18 critical infrastructures. 17 depend heavily on the grid, former CIA director says, calling the grid one of our greatest national vulnerabilities, which could wipe out America. EMP is an existential threat that could kill 9 of 10 Americans, and societal collapse could black out the grid for years and collapse all the other infrastructures necessary to sane Americans. Only a carbon tax can effectively reorient electricity demand and increase energy flexibility necessary to create a long-term, more reliable, and safe grid. Neil Chatterjee and Greg Bertelsen in 2022 for the Climate Leadership Council says that when the grid fails, the human and economic toll can be staggering, amplifying catastrophic costs. Electrification will triple our dependence on the grid. Large-scale infrastructure investment and tech advancements in storage, nuclear, hydrogen management tools will be required. We need to transform the grid while protecting consumers. Economy-wide carbon pricing is the most effective pathway towards deep decarbonization. Carbon pricing is aligned with grid reliability. Carbon pricing flexibility values all emissions reductions. Carbon pricing sends signals that drive reductions and support reliability. Carbon pricing supports long-term infrastructure investments, innovation, and market reforms. A steady, predictable economic signal provides investors, operators, and planners with better data. Thus, we affirm. And I'm ready for class.
Okay. Oops. Okay. How does a carbon tax influence energy production?
Right. A carbon tax influences energy production through the market signal it provides by telling consumers and businesses that we want to provide we want an energy transition and that you should pay for the pollution you cost on the environment.
Okay,
That
so
sends a signal.
I want to talk about something that you said there. So it's a market signal.
Yes.
What number would be necessary to change corporation or consumer behavior?
Well, I don't think talking about a specific number is really all too important. It will be implemented under normal means in regards to the social
What does
cost
that
of carbon. Normal means we're talking about the social cost of carbon. It will be calculated regarding the amount of emissions.
That's fine.
Okay.
Actually, how do we get the energy produced by windmills in places like Kansas to consumers in places like Florida?
Right. Well, first of all, to answer that, we think that consumers in Florida will definitely have their own sources of renewable energies to provide them with power. And regardless, funding and development will guarantee that transmissions will only get better with time.
Okay. And when you're saying transmission, I'm assuming this has to do with the grid. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. What is the grid?
The grid are the electricity producers and like storage facilities in America.
Okay. You've read evidence that is failing now. Why so?
Yes, it is under threat of climate change. Rising temperatures threaten infrastructure. Yes.
So rising temperatures threaten the physical infrastructure.
Yes.
That is your argument about why the grid is going to collapse.
Yes.
Okay. In places like Saudi Arabia, temperatures reached 120 degrees this past year. Why didn't their grids collapse?
Well,
How high does the temperature need to be in order for the grid to collapse, in other words?
Well, it's not just temperature. I forgot to mention that extreme weather events also pose a threat to the grids, and climate change exacerbates that. But it's also, if you think about it, climate change is continued exposure of these events to the grid system.
I suppose that makes sense, but that sets a pretty high bar for you to be able to solve. How do you guarantee that other countries might also adopt this carbon tax?
Right. So we believe a border carbon adjustment will create the necessary monetary push for other nations to develop their own climate policies, as well as the leadership that the United States proves it has.
This relies on a claim of the US's leadership as a global power.
No, it's not just leadership. It's also the border carbon adjustment.
Border carbon adjustment.
Yes.
Okay, so that has to do with taxes on imports and exports, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Russia is the world's biggest emitter of methane, a greenhouse gas that is 80 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. The US has trade embargoes with Russia due to the war in Ukraine and no leverage with them. How can a carbon tax affect Russia's emissions that are so much more powerful than like any other emissions because they're mostly methane?
Right. I think that's a great question. And I think overall that when we're talking about Russia, I think one, they don't want to be continuously paying more. And not only that, it's also our allies in Europe.
With the US. Okay. That's fine.
Before I begin the first negative constructive, I would like to extend some thank yous on behalf of Iowa Debate. First, thank you to the University of Minnesota's Director of Debate, Dr. David Krem-Helwick, who's back at the door, for helping us organize this public debate and hosting us here in Minneapolis. Thank you to our competitors from the University of Minnesota, Casey and Timmer, for engaging in this debate with us. I'm sure that it's going to be a lot of fun. Thank you to the alumni of the A. Craig Baird Debate Forum, whose contributions make our participation at events like these possible. Thank you to Tanya Uden-Holman, the Associate Provost for Undergraduate Education and the Dean of the University College, where Iowa Debate is housed, for your continuous support of our program. Thank you to the University of Minnesota's Communications Studies Department for their continuing commitment to forensics. And of course, thank you to all of the members of the public who have taken a little bit of time out of your evening to support our programs, both Minnesota and Iowa. And again, hopefully you'll learn a little something about carbon taxes. With that being said, let's start the first negative constructive. We negate that the United States federal government should implement a carbon tax. There are three key reasons why U.S. implementation of a carbon tax is a bad idea. First, a carbon tax does not solve climate change. Second, a carbon tax makes warming worse. And third, a rapid transition to renewables makes the grid more unstable. To our first point, a carbon tax does not solve climate change. We will make two subpoints here. Subpoint A, a carbon tax is too slow to address climate change. It does not incentivize corporations to change their behavior and does not become global fast enough to mitigate environmental damage caused by global warming. According to economist Michael Roberts in 2021, carbon taxes are proposed as solutions to climate change. Market solutions to climate change are based on trying to correct market failure via a tax. The problem is that climate change is not one market failure, but several: transport, energy, technology, finance, and employment. The EU commissioner admitted that, paradoxically, the current energy taxation directive is incentivizing fossil fuels and not environmentally friendly fuels. Climate change is getting worse by the day. The carbon tax solution, even if it worked to lower emissions, can never be implemented globally before tipping points. Allowing fossil fuel production to continue, market solutions will not be enough. Market solutions are not working because it isn't profitable to invest in mitigation. High upfront costs and uncertainties can't be priced. Investments for a low carbon economy are exposed to political risks, illiquidity, and uncertain returns, depending on policy mitigation as well as unpredictable technological advances. Now I'll move to our second subpoint, which is that a carbon tax will be circumvented. Empirical examples prove that the tax is either not raised or it will be repealed. According to Renee Cho from the Columbia Climate School in 2016, for Canada to achieve its Paris Accord goal, a carbon price of $30 per ton would need to reach $160 by 2030. But the tax was capped at $30 when a conservative government took over. Australia's tax was repealed. Systems can be gamed, credits sold to profit, allowances giving out to polluters continuing to pollute under too lenient of a cap. I'll now move to our second point, which is that green energy causes more carbon emissions. Alexander Dunlap, an expert in the effects of renewable energy technology, writes in 2018, distinctions between fossil fuels and renewable energy involve a sleight of hand. Renewable energy requires immense fossil fuel resources in construction, manufacturing, transportation, construction, and operation. For example, turbines require significant mining. Every stage of the mining process requires a large expenditure of fossil fuels, a fact that is neglected in ecological accounting. Rare earth mining is also disastrously inefficient. Technologies require levels of extraction excluded from carbon accounting. While the end goal of a renewables-based economy may sound much more sustainable than the status quo, the transition towards that economy is very concerning. In order to build technologies like solar panels and windmills, an absolutely massive amount of mining must be done. Because that mining equipment runs on diesel, there will be a drastic spike in carbon emissions that will immensely exacerbate environmental damage beyond the point of reversibility. Now for our third point, that the rapid transition to renewables makes the grid more unstable. The energy transition is impossible without a national grid. The grid is unstable because of high energy demand, as the affirmative has pointed out, and the fact that the grid is under local and privatized control. This means that the renewable transition alone cannot solve for instability. Nadja Popovich and Brad Plumer acknowledged in 2023, there is no single US grid. That makes it hard to build long-distance power lines needed to transport wind and solar. America's fragmented electric grid is a major obstacle to fight climate change. Tapping into the nation's supplies of wind and solar would be the cheapest ways to cut emissions. Many spots with the best sun and wind are far from cities and the existing grid. To make the plan work, the nation would need thousands of miles of large power lines that would span multiple grid regions. To reach 100% clean generation by 2035, transmission capacity would need to more than double in a decade. There is no single entity in charge of organizing the grid. The electric system was cobbled together by thousands of independent utilities. Highways, gas, pipelines, all of that is paid for and permitted at the federal level. But if the US can't build new transmission, 80% of emissions reductions might not happen. Existing power lines are often so clogged that they can't deliver electricity from wind and solar projects to where it is needed most. This means that the affirmative cannot solve for grid instability via a carbon tax, because the mandate of a carbon tax does not necessarily lead to the creation of federal energy infrastructure. This means that an influx in the usage of renewables in some places, like windmills in Kansas, does nothing to help the grid instability in places like Texas, because there's no way to transfer that energy. Additionally, because we have proven that a renewables transition increases emissions and thus causes more global warming, the grid will overheat significantly more after the implementation of a carbon tax, causing energy collapse even faster than in the status quo. Ultimately, we have presented to you 3 reasons why the implementation of a carbon tax is undesirable. A carbon tax cannot solve climate change because it is too slow and empirically will be circumvented because it's not raised or it is repealed. A rapid transition to renewables causes a spike in the usage of fossil fuels, and the grid becomes more unstable because of localized control as well as increased overheating. For these reasons, we must urge a vote in negation. Thank you. I am ready for cross-examination.
Okay. How does the negative world propose we solve warming without a carbon tax?
Yeah, so our job in this debate is not to provide you with an alternative to a carbon tax. Rather, our job is to simply, poke holes in your argument that a carbon tax would actually solve things like global warming. So if we provide the audience with significant doubt that you can solve things like global warming with the carbon tax, then they should vote negative.
Okay, that makes sense. Can you provide a comparative piece of evidence that says renewables require more harmful mining than fossil fuels?
Yeah, so this was the evidence from Alexander Dunlap that I just read in the 1NC. There's a couple of examples in this card that I think are really useful for this point.
Okay.
So Dunlap talks about the creation of windmills specifically, right? You have to mine the steel to make the windmills. And then something else that Dunlap talks about is the fact that we cannot industrially manufacture steel without coal. Like the ovens don't get hot enough without coal. So if you want to make wind turbines, you still have to extract a large amount of fossil fuels to perform the metallurgical processes, right? So that's more fossil fuels. And all of the equipment that mines the steel out of the ground is run by diesel.
All right, thank you. Do you have a timeline for renewable energy overload of the grid?
Yeah, so we think that in the status quo, the renewable energy transition is already happening, which the 1AC evidence agrees with. We think that that transition is currently safe and slow, but when the carbon tax causes a rapid shift to make that renewables transition even faster, corporations start cutting corners and it becomes very unsafe. And so that means that there's more likely to be grid collapse.
Okay, thank you. Why is Canada's carbon tax comparable to the United States?
I'm actually really glad that you brought up Canada. So the Canada example proves the fact that the US political system, because it's very turbulent, will likely circumvent the tax. So this is how the story of Canada's tax goes. They had a slightly more progressive government. They said, we're going to do a carbon tax. And in order for it to be effective, it needs to be raised to $160 by 2035, right? Then a more conservative government came around and said, we don't like taxes. We're going to say you cannot increase your tax. And then in April of this year, the government again said, hey, we're a little bit more progressive now. We can raise the tax again.
Okay.
And so in the United States, this functionally means that every 2 to 4 years when we have elections, the carbon price is up for debate. Corporations do not like it when they cannot make long-term projections.
Okay, sure. So how can a finite amount of fossil fuels support civilization's energy demands indefinitely?
Yeah, this is a really good question. So the 1NC evidence that talks about, or the 1AC evidence rather, that talks about why the grid is unstable points to the fact that we are just using drastically more energy than we really need, right? Like AI data models, cryptocurrency mining, all of those require massive amounts of energy. We think that we just don't need to be using that much energy. And additionally, when we make the slow transition to renewables, we don't run out of energy.
Okay.
For organizational purposes, I will first cover me and Timur's arguments and then move on to our opponents from Iowa's arguments. A carbon tax is necessary to spark green tech innovation and quickly transition us towards renewables. It directs companies to make the most efficient changes and spurs international follow-on. Warming causes extinction and worsens every other threat. Through droughts, heat waves, wildfires, flooding, they all overwhelm society's ability to respond and accumulate in the end of civilization. Secondarily, grid collapse outweighs every other impact. It underpins all critical infrastructure. Failure collapses society and causes mass death. Only a carbon tax is sufficient to resolve. It aligns grid reliability with energy flexibility and allows the scaling back of overburdening electrification. Now we'll address the reasons our opponents have argued that a carbon tax would be bad. First, a carbon tax can and will solve existential climate change. On subpoint A, first, a carbon tax does change corporation production habits. Both BP and Shell, two of the largest oil companies in the US, have each pledged more than $1 billion in internal carbon pricing. Additionally, corporations are showing huge support for carbon pricing. Mayana Dellinger writes in 2022 for LSU Journal of Energy and Law, companies are driving voluntary carbon markets will lead to political support. Companies are using internal carbon pricing to reduce emissions. 600 companies often exceed regulatory standards. BP and Shell pledge $1 million for carbon dividends, also supports carbon pricing. This outcry of support gives motivation needed to embrace climate change. The one policy stands tall above the pack, carbon pricing. Now onto subpoint B. First, I was factually incorrect about Canada's carbon tax. Most recent evidence votes affirmative. Campbell and Voverman write in April of this year for Forbes. On April 1st, 2024, the federal carbon tax increased from $65 per ton to $80 per ton. Second, the second argument applies solely to carbon credits associated with the emissions trading system, meaning they do not apply to our arguments about a carbon tax because we do not provide carbon credits. Third, a carbon tax drives the transition to renewable energy through economy-wide incentives. It cost effectively cuts emissions, spurs innovation across sectors, and turbocharges clean tech development. The tax rate's a predictable price signal, attracting investment to address shortages, grid constraints, and local opposition. That is our Bailey, Rourke, and Burleson evidence. That means even if the tax rate is not increased, the carbon tax can still resolve global warming through a renewable energy transition. Lastly, their evidence does not assume new green technology. Best studies prove green innovation is key and sufficient to achieve net zero. Dr. Ferris Burkin writes in January of this year for Science Direct. The evidence shows environmental innovation negatively and significantly impacts CO2. When eco-innovation is increased, CO2 will decrease. The implication is environmental innovations can substantially mitigate CO2, supporting neutrality. Default to this state, it uses the best models. Birkin continues. The error correction term ECT is significant, validating the regression outcome's robustness, indicating the null hypothesis is rejected. The Birchard-Gredfree and heterozygosity tests show no serial correlation. Further, the dynamic autoaggressive distributed leg model is a robust analysis. The results coordinate the environmental Kuznets curve. Innovation and clean tech, both conventionally and novel, ARDL simulation corroborate each other. Finally, outcome of CUSUM squared test shows the study model is highly stable. On their second argument, I was also mistaken. Renewables are a force for good. Two arguments. First, renewables are saving biodiversity. Freddie Juth writes in 2023. Findings illustrated that non-renewable energy has an adverse correlation with biodiversity. Non-renewable consume biodiversity via disruptions of habitats, extraction sites, pollution, and warming. Mining, larger settlements. REC exhibited a positive correlation on BHI. An increase in REC increases biodiversity sustainability. Unit root tests show variables are integrated. The FMOLS for robustness test revealed renewable energy enhances biodiversity. To prevent ecological deprivation, authorities should invest in clean energy. This lowers biodiversity loss. Overwhelming consensus of studies and models agree. Dr. Freddie Juth writes in 2023 for Science Direct. Juth investigated using the NARDL and found REC improves biodiversity. ULAC highlighted REC enhances the environment. Sethi's analysis revealed RE enhances ecological quality. Zhu supported similar results. It's also affirmed REC enhances ecological quality. Janger, Radelsky, Sharma, Sankey, Nathaniel explored association among REC and EF. The outcomes highlighted REC improves efficiency. Second is that renewables decrease extraction on every level. Casey Crownhout writes in April of this year for Technology Review. Low emissions energy sources have a smaller mining footprint than coal and natural gas. Technologies lead to a future with less mining. We forget about the dirtiness of our current system. The energy source with the highest mining burn is coal. Coal requires 20 times the mining as wind and solar. Natural gas requires twice as much. The sum of mining activities decreases even when we assume an incredibly rapid expansion of clean energy. There's been progress in cutting down material required for wind and solar. Solar modules have gotten more efficient. Recycling can cut demand. Now, Iowa missed the boat on our grid reliability arguments. 4 arguments here. First, the fact that the grid is failing now means that there is only a risk that a carbon tax will make it reliable. They defend this quote. There is zero chance that they will resolve grid stress. Wickerson et al. Proves that thresholds are overstressed now, but there is at least a chance that a carbon tax can solve, which means it's try or die for a carbon tax. Second, the IRA pushed mass adaptation of renewables. If they were causing the impact and not fossil fuels, we would have seen it by now. Third, they have it backwards. Only carbon pricing incentivizes green tech innovation that solves grid stress through better batteries and reliable energy like nuclear that run 24/7. All 3 of those arguments go unresponded to in the negatives first construction after being introduced in our Charity and Burleson evidence read in the first affirmative speech. Now, new advanced storage tech also solves fears on unreliability that their evidence fails to price in. Mohammed Worku writes in 2022 for NDPI. Large-scale energy storage systems alleviate many inefficiencies and facilitate full-scale integration of renewable energy. ESSs reduce power fluctuations, decrease pollution, and increase grid reliability. Studies have shown energy storage are capable of assuming firm power by charging during valleys. ESSs prevent energy from being spilled. This should be supported and enhanced. Forecasting and control techniques. All in all, every one of Iowa's arguments rests on outdated evidence and blatantly false assumptions. Global warming and grid collapse will be the end of civilization as we know it. There's only a chance that a carbon tax can stop this impending catastrophe. Iowa may be willing to risk our future, but we are not. Are you willing to sign our collective tombstone on mere risk we fail anyways? I stand open for cross-examination.
What does it mean that BP and Shell are doing voluntary carbon pricing?
Yeah, so they internally price energy sources between fossil fuels and renewables disproportionately to harm kind of use and more production of fossil fuels. So they've
Yeah.
pledged money to the carbon dividends plan, which kind of outlines how these 600 corporations are integrating carbon pricing.
Sure. So don't you think it's a little suspicious that we're listening to the oil companies on how we should do a carbon tax?
I don't really think that that is our argument or really relevant to the question that we are answering. We don't think that we are listening to oil corporations. We think that there is a very basic fact that renewable energy is becoming less expensive than fossil fuels, which means corporations and everyone among them has an incentive to support climate change,
Okay.
or I guess reduction.
Sure. You said in your speech just now that even if the carbon tax is not raised, that you can still solve for warming. How does that account for inflation when the tax becomes obsolete?
We think that there are a variety of arguments in our evidence that would answer this. We think, firstly, that early on emissions reductions are outsized in the benefit in comparison to long-term impacts. It creates a steady shock and integration of new technology that we think can scale up regardless if a carbon tax continues.
Right. So I guess I'm concerned that we wouldn't actually continue to do that, right? Like if the carbon tax goes away, don't the mining companies and the fossil fuel companies just go back to fossil fuels?
No, because the reason that renewable technology currently isn't being adopted at necessary rates is because there is a cost question of early research and development, which is the key
Okay.
barrier.
Yeah, the study you read from Dr. Festus Bakun is conducted specifically in the context of South Africa. How does that apply to the United States?
Well, first of all, I think that it's pretty evident that both teams in this debate are reading applicable evidence about countries other than the US. Secondarily,
Sure.
we think that the concepts and the reasons that a carbon tax was able to reduce these harms of mining is the reason it would still apply to the US.
So South Africa had a carbon tax?
Well, no,
Okay.
but we
So
think
the
it's
study
in
you,
no.
okay, that's fine. The study you read from Dr. Joof is about China. Does China have a carbon tax?
You read a piece of evidence about China. They have an
Does-
emissions trading system that we think is sufficient in terms of carbon pricing.
Okay, so they don't need a carbon tax.
They have
solve
carbon
one.
pricing, which is pretty similar.
Tax.
No,
That's
they
kind of
have
what you just said.
I'm not sure you understand an emission trading system and carbon tax are both carbon pricing metrics.
Sure, but you're saying that we need a carbon tax and that other countries will adopt a carbon tax
Yes.
if we do, correct?
Carbon pricing mechanisms are good. The US doesn't have one. Getting one would be good, and carbon border adjustments ensure follow on.
Sure. The Crown Heart evidence says that we're doing innovation now. Why does the carbon tax create more innovation?
Yeah, we think there's kind of two questions there. First, we think the barriers to early on research and development costs are stopping important levels of innovation.
Okay.
Okay. All right. I'm Spencer. I debate for Iowa. I am going to be giving the second negative construct. Okay. Oops. Okay. You should remember the 3 reasons why a carbon tax would be a bad idea. First, because a carbon tax does not solve climate change. Instead, companies will simply circumvent it. Second, because a carbon tax makes warming worse. It causes more emissions because renewables are fossil fuel plus. And finally, because a rapid transition to renewables makes the world more unstable. Winning even one of these claims means that you will vote negative. Our job in this debate is not to provide an alternative mode of solvency to climate change. It's just to provide doubt that a carbon tax can do what they have claimed it can. So if you have any doubt about the efficacy of a carbon tax, you should vote negative. You know that this is true because we explained this role, and in 1NC Cross-X, they agreed to it. They said that makes sense. In Cross-X of the 1AC, they were unable to answer our questions about Russia, which explained that Russia emits a greenhouse gas that is 80 times more powerful than the United States. This is our argument about doubt, because it proves that even they doubt their own claims about a carbon tax's ability to solve. They want you to think that our burden is to prove that a world of warming is better than a world of carbon tax. But But that makes no sense because it mischaracterizes what their evidence agrees is true about the status quo. Remember that all of their evidence says companies are developing renewables now. They are rolling them out slowly and safely. But when we adopt a carbon tax, it forces a very rapid renewables transition. The world of a carbon tax does not give the market adequate time to pick winners, so we're willing to pick anything at all. But not all renewable tech is made equal. Instead of doing what they're doing now, companies will simply look for the cheapest, fastest ways to transition to renewables and invent shoddy new tech that is dangerous. That's how we get mass production of Teslas and Cybertrucks that are cutting people's fingers off and hitting pedestrians in crosswalks. Now imagine the people in charge of this technological carelessness being put in charge of the entire grid and energy system, including the nuclear system that they elaborated in CrossX. This proves all three of our subpoints that I laid out at the top, that a carbon tax does not solve climate change, that it makes warming worse by foregoing better solutions, and it makes the world more unstable. Second, I'm going to talk about past examples of carbon pricing. They've completely missed the point of our argument about Canada. Miley explained this very well in CrossX. It's not that a carbon tax would be permanently repealed, which is what their answers to it presume, but rather that in order to stabilize the grid, we need a clear, consistent metric for companies to produce new innovations that aim for long-term stability and give companies a long-term picture of what a carbon tax would do. But as the Roberts evidence that we read in the 1NC elaborates, the back and forth of Canada's political climate and the implementation and repeal of their carbon tax demolishes this motive. Companies don't like when they can only forecast future plans for 2 to 4 years at a time, which means that the status quo of a slow renewables rollout is the most efficient way to solve for innovation. It is certainly more efficient than a fluctuating tax that destroys investors' plans. Their arguments about Shell and BP wanting a carbon tax is about Shell and BP wanting their own internal carbon pricing that they have control over. There are two responses. First, these companies have explicitly opposed a national tax. They are the ones lobbying against it. This is why they've put so much effort into circumventing carbon taxes every time they've happened. Second, Shell and BP support only very specific visions. The oil industry loves to pretend like they like carbon tax, but you should never take major corporations at their word. They're looking to win apocalyptic concessions in exchange for financial support, using the same tactics as gun lobbies do to skirt regulations and carve out loopholes. Umar Irfan, climate reporter covering the Department of Energy, writes in 2018, ExxonMobil will spend $1 million to lobby for a US carbon tax. In exchange, the company wants immunity from all climate lawsuits, which would also prevent further climate regulations. It would grant oil companies the kind of immunity from litigation that the gun law industry currently enjoys. This evidence clearly proves the argument that Miley is making in CrossX about why it's bad to take corporations at their word. This supports our framing arguments that I explained above about why the world of a carbon tax would make things worse because it prevents further climate regulations. But the Casey in the 2AC did not even mention the word Australia, which is our second example. This is where the question of repeal really comes into play, because when Australia's government implemented a carbon tax, the result looks nothing like the affirmative evidence predicts it would. Businesses were not incentivized to innovate. Instead, the cost of essential goods increased exponentially as companies scrambled to preserve profit. They increased cost of goods, cost of living spiked, citizens protested, the government repealed the tax, and outraged households even had to be reimbursed. This proves our first and second arguments about how a carbon tax does not solve climate change because companies will circumvent, and our second argument that a carbon tax would make warming worse by creating more emissions. Now, I'm going to talk about renewables. Minnesota wants you to believe that there is only one way to solve renewables now or never. That's not true. Their own arguments agree that renewable transition is happening now, slowly and safely. And we agree that a slow, thoughtful transition is better than panicked and rushed. But that's exactly what a carbon tax promotes. We would have to mine more rare earth minerals over the next 30 years than over the last 70,000 for a rapid society-wide transition to renewables. Think about everything you use in your daily lives, from cars to light bulbs. For immediate transition, we would need to throw all of those things away and buy new renewable ones. But that amount of waste is environmentally devastating. You should be wary of their evidence that claims renewables are better than fossil fuels in terms of the mining process. This conclusion is only possible if evidence has done improper ecological accounting. Our Dunlap evidence says the difference between fossil and renewables is an accounting trick. He calls it a sleight of hand because the 6 materials that make up renewables, like cement, plastic, and steel, which Miley talked about in Cross-X, are responsible for the majority of global fossil fuel emissions. So when they make claims like renewables are better than fossil fuels, that falsely implies that it is possible to produce renewables without using fossil fuels, which is untrue. If we win this claim, we win the debate because their arguments about both warming and the grid are predicated on the same false assumption that renewables would entail a world that absolutely does not use fossil fuels anymore. It supports our first claim that the carbon tax cannot solve climate change, and our second, that warming will be increased after the affirmative because their predictions are unable to account for the amount of emissions that would happen. Finally, they cannot win that building all these renewables would eliminate the need for fossil fuel use because their evidence agrees that we must use fossil fuels inevitably. That's because renewable energy comes from the environment. It only takes a cloudy day for the fields of solar panels that power entire sections of the grid to be utterly useless. Their evidence agrees that we need fossil fuels as a fallback in those instances. Finally, they want you to focus on the outcome of a carbon tax as solving the grid, but per 1AC Cross-X, they have to answer all of our arguments about how they would increase warming, because the reason why they say warming happens or the grid collapses is because warming happens.
Cross.
Oh, Cross-X.
Yes.
Sorry, I didn't mean to use Cross-X again.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead. You're good.
Okay. So why do you focus on Russia over all other allies, such as everyone in the EU and our allies in Asia?
Well, I think that there's 2 arguments here. First is that I don't know that my speech did focus on Russia. Instead, we focused on past examples of carbon taxes that have utterly failed to do the things you claim. Second, the reason why I asked you about Russia and 1AC Cross-X is because they are a high emitter of methane, which is 80 times more powerful than the carbon emissions that your evidence assumes.
Okay, sure. And then you say that the back and forth of carbon pricing fluctuations demolishes the motive and purpose of it, but would it still not be beneficial to have one in the first place?
Well, the reason why your evidence indicates that it would be beneficial is because it would spur a particular kind of innovation over the grid. But our argument is that it cannot spur that kind of innovation because in order to make those predictions, companies will have to know far into the future what the price of operations will be. But this kind of constantly changing the price of a carbon tax makes that kind of prediction impossible.
Okay. And then you say that with the renewables transition, it will require more mining for minerals, correct? But why is that actively worse than the mining and extraction being happening under fossil fuels right
Well,
now?
not quite. There's an imprecision in your question because our argument is not that transition to renewables requires more mining for the minerals themselves, but rather that in order to operate the drills that take rare earth minerals that power renewables out of the ground, those tools themselves run on fossil fuels. And so that extraction of fossil fuels is inevitable.
Okay. Is it not possible for these tools and these machineries to be fueled by electricity from green sources?
Well, I guess that not in the world of the status quo, right? In order to get to that world where we all have renewables, we literally have to mine more minerals over the next 30 years than over the last 70,000, and all of those minerals will be mined using fossil fuel powered equipment, which emits an extraordinarily high amount of fossil fuels, especially because the deeper into the earth we have to go, right, the more emissions it takes to get there. We exhaust the easiest to access sources first.
Right. And then you say companies will move towards the cheapest and easiest renewable sources. But then you say examples like Teslas and Cybertrucks as being poor energy sources. But how are these comparable towards the solar panels and windmills and that we have right now?
Well, not quite. I think my argument about those was more an example of the way that innovations that rely on or that are seeking profit over anything else produce unsafe results, right? And
how do you get unsafe results from solar panels and windmills?
Well, an unsafe result might come from something like the nuclear energy that you said you produce. There have been meltdowns globally multiple times that have devastated entire communities. Our argument is we should not risk it if we know that renewable transition happens safely now.
Okay, thank you.
Once again, I will be extending me and Timur's arguments and then responding to Iowa's. Iowa has conceded that immediate action is critical, with alarming prospects that the Earth will surpass 1.5 degrees by 2030. A carbon tax is essential for driving reductions by creating incentives for businesses and consumers to adopt cleaner technology, coupled with a carbon border adjustment that isn't mentioned a single time in the last negative constructive. It ensures that foreign competitors are held accountable and can no longer be free riders on U.S. emissions reductions. You should reject their framing. You should prioritize offense. They don't just need to win that a carbon tax might fail. They need to win that it is guaranteed to be bad and worse than the SQUO. Otherwise, there is at least a risk we solve, but zero risk that they ever will. Carbon taxes do create innovation. Every new tech is valued, but the most effective ones perform better in the market that only a carbon tax can create. Now, their arguments. A carbon tax will solve climate change. First, corporations are increasingly rallying behind carbon taxes. These policies empower them, will respond to investor demands. They are fundamentally transforming their production practices, driven by the need to capitalize on falling renewable energy costs, which is clean conceded. That is the Dellinger evidence. Now, their Australia argument is irrelevant. They didn't have support of industries like the US does. Secondarily, proving the tax will be rolled back does not prove it is a bad idea. There is at least a chance it won't be rolled back, which is a reason that voting affirmative is try or die for resolving climate change. Now, lawsuits are also irrelevant. They're incentives for companies to use renewables that aren't related to getting out of lawsuits. And secondarily, the Dellinger evidence cites 600 businesses. They merely cite one. Second, a carbon tax will be powerfully implemented by establishing robust, predictable, and rapid price reductions that triggers transitions. This framework will drive dramatic reductions, attracting significant investment. Substantial revenue will be strategically reinvested and will act as a transformative catalyst for a sustainable economy, fostering collaboration to meet climate goals, even if the price doesn't increase. Third, green tech fills in. It dismantles traditional barriers to renewable energy, reducing emissions through innovation. South Africa reveals renewables drive sustainable long-term declines in biodiversity loss and extraction. That's the Beacon evidence. It's best due to its robust methodology, emphasizing the critical need for stringent environmental regulations. Only we have a prodite for why our study is best. That's the Beacon evidence. Now, renewables may not be now or never, but solving climate change sure is. Weil cites WHO and the UNEWF, who both conclude that once 2030 hits, we will be locked into climate-based extinction. All clauses are irrelevant because a carbon tax stops every reason that warming is happening. They can't list a single alt cause, which means you should be highly skeptical. Now, yes, follow on. Their only argument is that we aren't a big trading partner, which is blatantly false. The Office of the United States Trade Representative writes in 2020, the US is the world's second largest trading nation, only behind China, $7.0 trillion in exports and imports. The dividend will not contribute to the continued use of fossil fuels. Our Bailey evidence is excellent on the question that the dividend will go to tech development. Now, renewable energy is a huge improvement to resolve harms from mining. First, renewables are key to stop the destructive nature of fossil fuel extraction and biodiversity loss. Best models find increasing renewable use increases biodiversity through substituting out harmful fossil fuels. Being about China does not matter. They historically had very high biodiversity loss, and post-carbon pricing, it was reversed. And economic complexity is irrelevant when our say utilizes the Nardal model to unequivocally demonstrate that renewable energy consumption dramatically enhances biodiversity. Second, renewable energy is a huge step to resolving extraction-based harms. It's better than the SWO on every metric. Renewable energy significantly reduces mineral mining and extraction compared to fossil fuels, with coal requiring a staggering 20 times more rock excavation than solar or wind for equivalent energy generation. This stark contrast not only debunks misconceptions about clean energy's resource demand, but also underscores the overlooked environmental devastation wrought through our current fossil fuel dependent system. That's the Crown Heart evidence that thoroughly debunks Iowa's claims the renewables are just as bad as fossil fuels. We extended that new renewable storage technology decisively tackles intermittency. That's the WRCU 22 evidence. Now, climate change is the most urgent and precarious existential threat facing humanity, with the terrifying likelihood of surpassing a catastrophic warming threshold of 1.5 degrees in the next 6 years. If we fail to act decisively, the IPCC starkly warns that dire health, environmental, and economic consequences of inaction demand immediate and radical reductions. There is zero risk continued use of fossil fuels will save us unless you are so sure you are willing to risk my future and ours. The small risk that carbon tax fails, you must affirm as our last shot at resolving this existential crisis. Extinction always and should always outweigh a tiny risk of failure. Thank you.
Tyler, would you like me to wait? At the end of this debate, there is no way that you are not voting for the negative. We have won this debate for 4 key reasons. The first reason is that we have done better analysis of the affirmative's evidence than they have. You should pay attention to every time I mention one of their studies throughout this speech, because I will be debunking almost every single one of them. The second reason why we are winning this debate is because the affirmative has not sufficiently proven that a carbon tax will solve climate change. The third reason why we are winning this debate is that the carbon tax will actually make warming worse. The affirmative has not addressed any of these arguments. And the final reason why we are definitely winning this debate is because a carbon tax causes a rapid transition to renewables, which is detrimental to both global warming and the grid. To our first point, which is that a carbon tax does not solve climate change. Now, the affirmative is going to get up and tell you that they are providing all of these market incentives for the market to suddenly shift drastically away from the usage of fossil fuels. However, you should remember the moment in 2AC Cross-X where I asked about why renewable energy has to use coal. I gave the specific example of windmills. Windmills are made with steel. And the only way that we can melt steel to make wind turbines is using coal. So if we have to make more wind turbines, that means that we have to extract and burn more coal than in the status quo. That also means that you should remember the argument that Spencer made in the 2NC about how the grid still has to rely on the usage of fossil fuels as a fallback, because all it takes is one cloudy day for the solar panels to be useless. The market requires stability, and the thing that is stable right now, and even post-implementation of a carbon tax, is the continued extraction and burning of fossil fuels. Now, let's talk about our second point, which is how the carbon tax actually exacerbates global warming. There are 2 reasons why this is true. The first reason is most of the stuff that I just said, right? The renewables transition requires more fossil fuels. So not only do we have to maintain a stable amount of fossil fuel energy, but we also need to have additional fossil fuels to power the mining equipment and the ovens that are melting steel to make wind turbines. This means that the affirmative cannot provide a world where we at least temporarily do not burn more fossil fuels when we have a carbon tax. The second reason why a carbon tax makes warming worse is because other countries do not necessarily follow on. The first affirmative rebuttal was very good on giving you statistics on why the US does a lot of trade. And we can agree that the US has a lot of trade allies. But what the affirmative has not done is address the critical example of Russia. If Russia does not follow on to the United States carbon tax, then they cannot solve global warming, and they cannot prevent other countries from buying Russian oil because it will continue to be cheaper absent a carbon tax. This argument has never been addressed by the affirmative and is uniquely a reason why you should be very skeptical of a carbon tax. A lot of their solvency about how they can solve global warming, because remember, warming is a global issue, not just an issue in the United States. All of their solvency arguments on this are based on the fact that every other country in the world adopts some form of carbon pricing. And this simply isn't true. Even if only one country, Russia, does not adopt that carbon tax, they have no solvency, which means that you vote negative. Now, let's talk more succinctly about the third point, which is that a rapid transition to renewables makes the grid more unstable. Remember all of the arguments that I've made throughout this speech about how we need more fossil fuels to power the renewables transition. And the grid requires fossil fuels for stability. But an argument that the affirmative has never addressed in this round is the fact that one of the reasons the grid is unstable is because there is no national grid. I spent a lot of time in the first negative constructive telling you about the fractured nature of the grid in the United States. It is cobbled together by thousands of independent utility companies. And so to imply that we can get the renewable energy from Kansas that comes from windmills to places like Texas, who maybe don't have a lot of windmills, is a bit ridiculous, and it cannot happen in the status quo. The affirmative also does not provide you sufficient reason to believe that a carbon tax leads to the type of infrastructure development that would solve this problem, which means that you can vote negative on the basis that the grid cannot be solved by a carbon tax. But the carbon tax actually makes the grid more unstable. This is because the affirmative cannot solve for global warming. And when warming increases, the physical infrastructure of the grid is put at risk. So for all of those reasons, you must vote negative against the implementation of a carbon tax. Thank you.
Yeah, so for the folks who are in the room, I just passed out a QR code. If you use the camera on your phone, you should be able to see or you should be able to see a Google form where you can vote for either the affirmative from the University of Minnesota or the negative from the University of Iowa. For the folks on Zoom, I just sent a link directly to the Google form. There's no QR code for you all. We'll wait a minute or two as we let people vote both in person and online.
While folks are voting, does anybody have any questions for the debaters? Or anyone?
It does not seem like we have any questions online.
Well, I have lots of questions. So open question for the debaters. What assumptions you had about US climate policy have been changed by the research you've done in the last couple of months as you've gotten ready for this time? Folks, feel free to jump in.
The Zoom here and stuff.
I believe so.
I think something that I learned a lot about is what the process of a renewables transition would look like. I wasn't really informed before on all of the things it takes to make things like solar panels. And so after doing research, it was really nice to learn what that process actually looks like. Where do we get those minerals from? And where, renewable infrastructure is actually put in the United States, and where current plans that have maybe been proposed say that we might put it. I think that was really useful information.
I learned a lot about how that actually. I didn't know how the market worked. I didn't know the intricacies behind all the different types of taxes. Like, I didn't know what the difference were. But now reading a lot of literature about what is a capital tax and like what is a rebate and what is a carbon tax actually, like what does it do? Where does it go? What's upstream? What's downstream? That has been pretty cool to learn about. I had no idea what any of that was before this.
I also think that when you start to do this research, you start to kind of look around and see all of the ways that it impacts our day-to-day lives. We were driving through, you know, missions, but also just kind of basic things like on like a cereal box or on a plane ticket. It's like, do you want to offset this, you know? And so learning the process of what those offsets entail is sort of super educational and like super disturbing about what it actually means to sort of offset and you know, unit of emissions.
Any other questions from the audience? So bracketing the positions you folks argued today, because obviously, you know, no one's assuming you folks are endorsing the ideas that you advocate per se. What do you think the federal government should do to address climate change?
I think that based on a lot of the research we've done, it is likely a combination of a lot of things, right? So it seems as though some kind of market-based instrument is necessary because a lot of the people polluting are people who operate in the market, right? I've also seen a lot on geoengineering or ways that we can pull carbon out of the atmosphere. Something really interesting, I think, is there are people who have sort of genetically engineered trees. They call them super trees, and they suck more carbon out of the atmosphere when they do photosynthesis than a normal tree does. So probably some combination of preventing more emissions from happening, maybe through a market-based measure, and pulling some of the existing carbon out of the atmosphere would be necessary.
Yeah.
I think it came unplugged, judging by watching the Zoom video.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just gonna repeat the question. So the negative made an argument about the amount of material mined for renewable transition, and the affirmative made an argument about the similar amount of resources required for fossil fuels. Does this apply to the maintenance of a fossil fuel-based grid and a renewable grid, or just the upfront requirements for a transition?
So I presume it would apply to both, like logically. I think that there is a sort of entire section of literature and studies, not just about the fossil fuel cost of renewable extraction, which is what we were sort of the argument we were making in this debate. The reason why we're making that specific argument is because the affirmative was like fossil fuel extraction is bad, right? So we make that argument, it more directly interacts with all of their claims. But with a kind of second level of argument that Ryan might be gesturing to here, in terms of the ecological cost of rare earth minerals, which are typically mined in places that have historically been colonized by the United States. And those are like the chips that go into our iPhones and like computers and everything we use. And the kind of ecological and colonial devastation that wreaks on communities and environments. That's something that I don't think that we, you know, got to talk about much in this debate, but I think that's something that I didn't know about right before doing a lot of research on this topic. And so I think that if we're talking about, you know, would a grid would a fossil fuel based grid still require fossil fuels? Obviously, yes. But would a renewable grid, even if we were to use renewables to mine for more renewables, still produce, some level of like environmental destruction and violence? Also, yes, but in the kind of other way I was describing.
Minnesota, you want to add something to Spencer's answer? Perfect. Okay. So for those folks who are in person, we would invite you all to stay and chat with the debaters. I do get the pleasure to announce the decision. We had 32 votes cast in this debate, which is perhaps one of the biggest panels that you'll get in a college policy debate round. And the decision on a 20-12 is for the negative from the University of Iowa. Okay, and I believe that concludes our 2024 fall public debate between the University of Minnesota and the University of Iowa. Thank you all for taking time out of your days and stopping by to listen into our students, develop some of the arguments that they're working on for this season's topic in this, albeit slightly different format than how we usually compete in regular season tournaments. Have a good evening